Hello friends, Buddy here at House of Props, and today's build doesn't need any introduction. It is that well known. Yes, I'm talking about Gandalf the White Staff from the Lord of the Rings, the Two Towers, and the Return of the King. This staff is completely 3D printed, and in this video I'll show you how I made this 6-foot staff out of 9 individual pieces. As many of you know at this point, I'm a huge Lord of the Rings nerd, and this has been something that I've been wanting to make for quite some time, but I've never been able to work up the nerve to do it because the top of this thing has always intimidated me. But I finally worked up the nerve, sat down with AutoCAD and Blender, and knocked it out. So without any more, let's get started. While the rest of the staff pieces are printing, I'll begin work on the intricate top piece. It prints in 2 pieces and can be assembled using the peg that's included in the files, but first let's start to remove the print line texture. To do that, I start sanding the piece with some 120 grit sandpaper. The reason I'm doing this initial sanding by hand and not with my hand sander is because I didn't want to damage the delicate points on the top, and it's best to print this piece with a 25% infill. While I do that, I would really appreciate it if you would click the subscribe button to follow this channel, if you haven't already. It's completely free to you and you will help this channel grow. Plus, if you click the notification bell, you can get notified when a new project is released. Thank you. When finished with the 120, I switch to some 220 and repeat the same process. Sanding this intricate detail is a little awkward, I'm not going to lie, but I found by working with small pieces of sandpaper and not rushing it, I was able to reach practically all the surface. The same steps were repeated to the staff pieces when they finished printing, and I went ahead and assembled the top pieces by gluing the support peg in between them, but before attaching the staff to the top, I'm going to assemble the bottom section first. To make the piece more solid and have a little bit more weight, I'm using a 4-foot 6-inch piece of 1/2-inch aluminum conduit. This will make the staff feel more authentic than if I had used some PVC as support. To make the pipe fit really snugly and to also provide some shock absorption, I glue a strip of 2mm foam around the conduit where each 3D printed piece will sit. This will also keep the support from working loose over time and rattling inside the shaft. Before inserting the conduit, I coat both the pipe and the foam with some E6000. I use a generous amount so it'll attach nicely and also provide some extra padding. Then it can be pushed into the 3D printed shaft pieces. I started with the bottom piece personally, so I would always be pushing down, but you could start with the top if you wanted. You can see how the foam definitely gives it a nice snug fit. Then the process can be repeated with the next shaft piece. I push them completely together and remove the excess glue that squeezes out. Then I back the last shaft piece up about 1/4 of an inch so I can apply some CA glue where the two will join. Then the pieces can be pushed back together and aligned. Then just a couple of drops of zip kicker will cure the glue in just a few seconds. The reason I'm using the CA glue with the E6000 is because the CA glue will cure more quickly than the E6000, but the E6000 gives a better bond over time. And then the process can be repeated until the entire shaft is assembled. Then the top decorative piece can be glued onto the top peg on the shaft. To attach these, I squeeze the CA glue into the recessed area on the topper and some E6000 around the peg like so, and then some CA glue around the outside ring of the E6000. Then the topper can be put in place and the excess glue removed before aligning and setting with zip kicker. After letting the E6000 cure overnight, everything is now firmly attached and solid. I'm going to use my hand sander with a 220 grit pad to run over all the piece joints just to make sure there aren't any glue buildup deposits that could create any unevenness on the surface. With that finished, the seams can be filled with a glazing and spot putty. I tried to avoid the putty touching my skin since it's toxic, so I use a palette knife to apply a generous layer over the seam. You also want to press the putty into the seam, otherwise it has the potential to be too thin and crack open later on. Also, the putty does shrink when it dries, so you may find that depending on how thick you applied it, you may have to apply a second layer before continuing. Then, after the putty has completely dried, I sand it down with some 120 grit sandpaper. The glue has helped fill the seams, but this putty step just reaches into all the little mist spots and will help the shaft look like a solid piece of wood. Once everything's all smooth, the staff can be sprayed with some 2-in-1 filler and sandable primer. I will typically spray 2 to 3 coats on 3D prints, and since I want this to be really smooth, I will use 3 in this case. This step will work as a primer, but it will also fill in any print lines that may not be as smooth as they need to be. Once all the layers have dried, I want to even out the surface a little more, so I'm using some 400 grit sandpaper and just lightly sanding the surface to remove any irregularities or unevenness in the primer. After the 400 grit, I want to wet sand the staff, so using a brush I apply a little bit of water and then polish up the primer with some 1000 grit sandpaper. When wet sanding, I found it easier to work in small manageable sections than trying to take on the whole piece at once. I've said this before in other projects and I'll say it again, I know it seems like there's a lot of sanding, but the time spent doing it is so worth it because you'll end up with a piece that you're really happy with and that doesn't look as if it was 3D printed. With all the sanding finally finished, it was time to paint, and this project gets a really simple paint job. I begin by basing the staff with some white acrylic, and for this project I'm using a fine bristle brush. That way the brush will leave behind some very subtle lines and it'll make the staff look like it's wood. I do try to even out the brush marks as I go in order to avoid stop-start lines and to create fluidity with the marks. Another thing is, since the staff is so smooth, it took 2 coats of the white to get even coverage. Then, once the white had dried, I took some white acrylic and mixed in a little bit of burnt umber. It's hard to see under the studio light, but this gives the shaft an off-white color very similar to the prop used by Sir Ian McKellen in the films. The painting process is exactly the same as the white base. Long, fluid lines to create continuity in the texture. And like that, Gandalf the White's wizard staff is completely ready for display or your next cosplay. I was super surprised how fast and easy the staff was to build. After the pieces printed, it only took 2 days to go from the original 9 pieces to the finished prop. Let me know what you think of the outcome and the process that I used in the comments below, and if you would like to make one of these for yourself, you can find a link to the files in the below description, and I hope you enjoyed this build. If you did, please give it a thumbs up, share it with friends, family, and anyone else you can think of. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and I'll catch you on the next one. Have a great day. And remember, if you are building any of my builds or using any of my templates, feel free and tag me at Haas of Props on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok because I would really like to see your fantastic work. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.